My name's Greg Ornett. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a consultant at Advisory.Works and I'll be the moderator or the MC for this afternoon. And the way that we'll go through this is we'll have the panel questions. Some are general questions, some are rather pointed. Then we'll have an opportunity for some questions from the floor. We're trying to keep more opportunity for you to ask those questions that are more pertinent to you, so we'll keep it short and punchy for the panel, and then open more time for you to ask questions. It'll probably come as no surprise for those here today that the recent research shows that about 48% of businesses in New Zealand are facing succession in the next 5 years. And that's because many baby boomers are looking to leave their businesses, or we're transferring partnerships, etc. This may be through a variety of scenarios, from a sale to a management buyout, to appointing a CEO or a GM and retaining ownership, so more of a transition, or to family succession. And whether this is an intermediate or immediate consideration or something longer term, we need to be thinking about this now. Unfortunately, the lessons from this don't need to be learnt the hard way. And I guess the first one is that succession is a process, not an event, and it is going to take a lot of time. As I said, this afternoon, we've assembled a panel of experience and expertise to bring out a wide variety of perspectives. Some who have been through it and have the battle scars to show it, some who have helped people through it as well. And we'll bring out the insights, the good, the bad and the ugly, the good lessons, the things you don't want to do, and learn the hard way yourselves. And hopefully we'll also give you some key considerations or advice that you'll be able to take away and implement into your own businesses. I'd firstly like to introduce our panel. Firstly is Kate Morrison. She's a partner at Morrison & Horgan, specialising in governance, strategy, financial structuring and succession for small to medium businesses. Kate has a background in investment banking and risk in the UK with firms such as Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank, and holds a number of governance roles locally. And when I asked her what she did in her spare time, she laughed and said, "Spare time? I have a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old and a husband, and I work. And managing all of that, I don't have spare time." Thanks for coming along, Kate, to share your insights. Kendall Langston is the CEO of Advisory.Works, and he's in a situation that has a board and the owner and founder still operating also within the business. Kendall is also the chair of several boards currently in various stages of leadership transition. And as a consultant, Kendall has helped numerous businesses work through successful succession, sale or listing processes. Interestingly, he is also facing succession within their family farming business, and so is having to live what he teaches. Paul Taggart is the CEO of Taggart Earth Moving, and Taggart has been operating as a family business for over 60 years. Hopefully, you can tell that Paul hasn't been the leader that whole time. Paul only recently took over as the CEO, going through family succession in the business with his parents, and also has 2 siblings within the business, and they've recently instituted governance structures. Notably, they recently won the Environmental Award at the annual Canterbury Contractor Awards. Congratulations, Paul. Lastly is Ben Badger from KPMG. Ben joined KPMG into the private enterprise team in Christchurch after a career in banking, where he was a senior commercial manager. His work in banking saw him finding solutions for clients in the challenge and opportunities that the rebuild has been around Christchurch. He has specialist skills in structuring and finding solutions, working capital management, business strategy and succession planning. And interestingly, he's a keen chef and entertainer. And so if he wasn't actually doing the Advisory.Works, he'd be a restaurateur. He didn't go as far as extending an invite to everyone to his place on the peninsula over Christmas to try out his skills. I thought, team, that we'd start with planning and looking ahead for change and understanding that this is something that we need to do. What are the general observations of businesses preparing for succession or leadership transition? And Kate, I might start with you.
I have a slightly different perspective on this, actually, from a lot of people who talk about succession. There are some very key building blocks that we'll talk about later on, very specific things like what's the right structure, what am I actually looking at as a succession solution, is it a sale of the business, is it bringing in management, is it bringing people through the company who can actually take over. For me, and for Sinead and I as we work in our business, it's all about people, it's all about clarity of vision, it's all about being extremely focused on what you want out of this process as a business owner. So what I mean by that is when you are transitioning, whether it's selling your business entirely or whether you're moving to a role where you're more of a governor or a director as opposed to actively running the business, what's important to you? Do you understand your personality? Can you prise your fingers off the wheel? Are you able to empower the people who are going to come in and take over from you? And what do you want to do afterwards? Because that's a really key part of the process that people forget. You might have 20, 30, 40 years, possibly more, after you've exited your business. What does that hold, and how are you going to plan for that? So for me, that's the really important piece to get clear at the beginning of the process, and then you can start to work through the more specific challenges of succession.
Kendall?
My observation is it has a far bigger impact on the people and the stakeholders of the business than perhaps is acknowledged or understood. I've seen it where perhaps everybody in the business knows that succession is on the horizon, and they actually want some certainty around what that looks like. I've seen it where key business relationships actually are asking around the peripheral about it. They want certainty around continuity of the business and the relationship, and to know there is a plan. So that's an observation, that it has a far wider impact than perhaps the founder or the owner or the leader of the business understands or acknowledges. And the other thing is, too often it's left too late. Often an illness or an illness of a spouse will elevate or bring forward the need to make this happen. And it's not something that can happen in a short period of time. It's a journey, and it takes several years to get right. So,
Thanks, Kendall. Paul?
Yeah, I guess for me, being the successor of our family business, my parents had no plan, and they thought that they were going to live forever and probably outlive me and my siblings. So I think if you are on that journey to hand over the baton to the next generation, I think you want to be doing it sooner rather than later. Don't leave it till the people that you're handing it over to are entering their twilight years as well. So yeah, I think plan early, even if you don't execute at that time, at least get a plan in place so that you're ready when the time comes.
Yeah, and I guess just to reiterate, certainly from looking at the clients we work with, where it's going really, really well is going back to where there's really clear purpose. What are the key kind of shareholder and business objectives that people are working to, and what the shareholders actually want, and therefore what the business can achieve. Those two kind of cornerstone things need to be really, really clear. And then early engagement, that's an absolute non-negotiable. I can think of a dozen case studies that are sort of live at the moment where we've been asked to come and assist with a succession project, and it might be around someone exiting, it might be around bringing investment in, and we've been brought in far too late, and often the value equation's kind of well off the mark of what the vendors were expecting to achieve from selling down on part of the business. So.
So what do we see as, what are the key building blocks for developing the business towards succession or transition? When we think about it, it's not necessarily selling the business. It's sort of part of this thing is just handing over the reins to someone else. It's a leadership responsibility. What are the building blocks for starting to make this happen? If I'd start down your end, maybe Ben.
Look, I think, and again, it's actually starting with a plan and acknowledging that the journey to get ready to be opportunity ready or sale ready or investment ready is not one that you can typically deliver on overnight. And very, very rarely are companies kind of sitting in an investment ready, opportunity ready in the context of if you were to think about going into a due diligence process, or a buyer's climbing around under the hood, thinking about whether they're going to buy, what you're selling. So key component is setting out on that journey, and I think getting some independent support on planning key milestones in that journey.
Kendall, would you like to add?
I think what's key is a little bit to Ben's point around purpose, but the values and the long-term vision is important. If you have that in play and you have a longer, like a Horizon 3 that's outside your one, your annual or your 2 or 3, and you're well on the way and can demonstrate, it's hugely valuable, and it makes it easy to get people who fit, so attract buyers that fit, and cause often one of the concern is, well, if I sell this, where will it go? The other key things, two key things come to mind: making it a priority, a high priority, and not just around ownership succession, but succession of leaders. So that means you have a leadership culture where you're investing in leaders, and courage. You've got to have some courage to put these discussions on the table, because everyone knows they're there, they're the elephant in the room. And often, certainly when we do vision and lift a horizon outside an annual operational cycle, it's the first thing on the table. Suddenly you're dealing with succession, and for the first time you're having to have that discussion.
Kate, what are your thoughts around the building blocks?
I think, to add to what the others have observed, I think it's particularly within family businesses or family-dominated businesses, it's having that external perspective. It's having the ability to bring in one or more people from outside who can tell you straight where your strengths and weaknesses are, where you have to develop capability, where you potentially have leadership potential within the company that you may or may not have recognised because it's somebody who's either a family member who's been there for 20 years, who's just quietly got on with doing the job, but now, given the opportunity, can step up to the plate. And it's being able to sort through some of those slightly more challenging issues within the company. And I'll go back to it again. I think clarity of purpose, a number of us have mentioned it, really clear purpose, really clear goal as to what you want out of this process. If you've taken the business to a state where you're comfortable with what you've achieved and you're relatively agnostic as to what happens next, that's going to inform an entirely different set of choices as to someone who's built a legacy. It's a family business that's been going for multiple generations. It's incredibly important to the family name that it continues to grow, thrive and prosper. You're going to take another very different set of decisions in those circumstances. So establishing that really early on is critical.
So Paul, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question then. We've heard from the advisors. How did you go about it, and how did you approach it?
I guess we probably approached it through frustration because nothing was happening, and my parents probably didn't have great experience with external advisors, probably over the 55 years that they were steering the ship, and we took a different approach and did go out and seek the external advice, and for us it's been a real game changer. We did the change, or we started making the change even at the stage when my parents were still at the helm, and I guess we just knew that we had to keep pushing forward, otherwise if you're standing still, you're getting past, and we were in that space. I guess my parents treated the business as a lifestyle, and it probably worked reasonably well with very little structure. And but I guess if you want to take it to the next generation, you really do have to put it in a good stead for them to take over the reins. But I guess they weren't willing to do it, so we did it ourselves. And I guess we've worked with Advisory.Works for 4 odd years, and we changed lawyers and accountants, and just recently we put an independent board in place, so my sister and myself and 2 other independents on the board, and I guess it's just bringing the outside in, and it's amazing what you don't know till you find out what you don't know, so I'd certainly go to the market and seek advice.
Kendall, how difficult in your experience has it been in your family farm to get people around the table and get a view and start the process?
Well, yeah, I mean, I come from 104 years in the family farm, a couple of thousand acres in South Canterbury, and a little bit, as Paul says, you've sort of got to force it, unfortunately. A lot of farming families, it's so emotionally tied to the land, that it takes quite a bit of courage to even get the forum to have the discussions in a safe place. I chose to bring an external in who specialised in that area, and even she, I've got to say, was pretty challenged. We're not there yet, we're on the journey. Obviously got a sibling involved and a mother who's been on that place for her whole life. So, it is interesting going through it. Very emotionally, it's the emotional stuff to be able to make good, clear, logical decisions, but still acknowledge some of the family connections for sure.
Now, you will have noted that we were meant to have Clive Washington with us also this afternoon. Unfortunately, he got pulled away at the last minute to the West Coast, but he has given me his notes that he'd jotted down to some of the questions, and I really want to share those with you now because there's some real gold in there as well. And so when we posed those questions to Clive, he said, initially I had no succession plan. I hadn't even thought about it. I loved what I was doing. I was going to be running to the business until I was 80 plus, and then my son would take over and that was going to be easy. He said then he had a few health problems that started slowing him down, and it all changed and it became not so easy. I felt that I had a great culture in the business as well as great documented systems, which were really important to him. However, to step back and leave the day-to-day running of the business to someone else and not being hands-on was a somewhat difficult decision to make. He had a board in place, however, it wasn't really fully structured in the way that he now has. He had appointed a CEO, however, this didn't work, and it didn't work well as he was coming in raw and didn't understand the business enough to make the decisions that would allow us to strengthen the profit and increase the sales for the business. This lasted a short time and he left for another position that was more up his alley. This then allowed us to appoint a long-standing staff member into the position of Group General Manager. And this has been a difficult process for our Group General Manager to me being on site and needing to move off site and get out of his hair basically. But once Clive set up those disciplines for himself and led it more from a board level, it's all come together. Management and directors have both worked together to set up a strategic plan that's taking them forward, and this is now a great management tool that can be called on monthly in board meetings to ensure that we're meeting our objectives. And since this has been all put in place, he's become more relaxed about how he can manage the business in a different ownership relationship now that he has that in place. And I'll be bringing Clive's insights into the conversation as we go through. So thinking about leadership and culture and the people side of it, which we've sort of touched on, how do you build or buy or bring in the next leader? And how do you get the right person? And how do you ensure you get buy-in? And Kendall, if I could start with you.
Well, that's a journey. I think it is about having a leadership culture where you invest in the ongoing development of your people. Some of the tools are like a talent matrix, which I'm a great believer in, where annually you're putting people on the matrix and starting to build or expand them professionally to take the next level. And of course, some will make it, some won't want to go further, but it's a great point to build into their one-on-ones and the way you lead them. But I firmly believe you've got to have a clear culture. I like to call it an intentional culture, where it's stated team rules, leader behaviours are important, where you actually identify, well, what are the expectations of a leader in this business, no matter what level, and that's sort of what we train and develop our people to. So that would probably be a key part of it.
Okay.
I think for me, I think it's a really hard thing to do, particularly if you're running a small to the small end of medium-sized business and you've built that up yourself. To create the space and the opportunity for the people that you've brought into the business to grow into leadership roles is fine in principle, but to actually do it in practice, you've got to be able to take a step back and be aware of the control that you exert over all of the decision-making processes, the way that the business is run, the way that it's structured, the way that things have always been done around here. And that is very challenging, and we've worked with a lot of companies going through that process. But it's incredibly rewarding if you take that next level of management down and create space for them to grow into those roles and really trust them, believe in them. You can actually see incredible results quite quickly. We work with a lot of business owners who don't necessarily want to exit their business immediately, but they want to free themselves up to do other things because they've spent 20, 30 years grafting every hour that they have building the business, and it's time to move on. Allowing them to see that they've actually built a really capable team next level down is incredibly rewarding. So I would encourage everybody to think about what they need to do to make that happen. But it's critical to the success because, as Clive has alluded to, bringing in someone from outside is risky. It may work really well, but alternatively it can be disastrous. And it sets you back 6, 12, 18 months, depending on how much collateral damage it causes. Because in his situation, I was clearly an individual within the company who had the ability and the desire to step up to take on that management role, who was overlooked in that outside recruitment process. And there is, there are personal relationships to rebuild after those sort of things have happened. So,
Ben, what have you seen in your experience?
Look, I think when you're talking about building leadership, part of it to me, where I've seen it go really well, is where people are really, really clear on what the purpose is. So what's the thing anchoring the business and where are we going? And if you're talking about bringing people in to go on that journey, then that becomes a really big anchor. And so getting alignment of, personality and technical skills and getting the balance right is really, really key. I think, so often we get the hire in because we think we've got a technical need and we've actually missed on the leadership and purpose piece and alignment, and that's where things fall over. So, yeah.
Paul, again, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question because you alluded to it earlier, in that Winsborough research shows that New Zealand businesses typically go through a life cycle where the owner gets to the point where he has the 3 Bs, the BMW, the batch and the boat, and then they sort of take the foot off the accelerator and the business plateaus out for some time and ticks along nicely, and you alluded to your parents having a lifestyle business. How important is it for the successor to come in and re-energise the business and take it to a new level, and how have you approached that?
I guess it's extremely important, and I guess when that generation starts to back off and enjoy the BMW and the boat and the batch, you should be thinking about re-energising it probably even before they buy the first asset. You can see that it's backing off, but probably in my situation, my parents didn't back off to their own detriment, and couldn't let go was their problem. So my father went on and bought a farm because he didn't think he had enough to do, which was probably not the right thing to do, but anyway, he's enjoying it these days. And but maybe it would be nice to be in that situation where you do end up with the BMW, the batch and the boat. So I think when the time comes, or when you think that the time's due to arrive, make sure you do start building a team below you to carry on so that you don't lose momentum. We certainly lost momentum. We didn't have a lot of structure in place, and we didn't have a lot of management. I guess I work on a management pyramid, probably should look like that. Ours was like that, and it had a sharp bit on the top that was right up my backside most of the time, and it wasn't a fun space to be in. So we've now got the pyramid, and it works really, really well. We're developing leaders through that management team, and it is really exciting to see people grow in their role and see who actually does float to the top. And I guess the ones that you'd like that think could surface don't, they sink, and you get a few surprises, which is really exciting.
I recall talking to you one time and saying you recently went through succession. You went 7 years ago, and we still are. Dad's down there sort of every second day and doing things. How difficult was it for your parents to create that space for you to be able to lead in your own way and do things differently? And how did you sort of go through that process?
I guess I've probably led the business for a long time, but I felt like I had the reins on and didn't have the freedom to make some real game-changing decisions. We sort of got stuck in that holding pattern. So, as I said, probably 3 years before we took over the business, out of frustration, we just bulldozed through and potentially pushed our parents to the side and just did stuff. Managed to buy a business that they didn't know about until it was done, and made a whole lot of executive decisions which really benefited the business. But it is pretty frustrating sitting on the bench waiting for your calling, and when it doesn't happen. There was a number of days when thoughts went through my mind that perhaps I should just go and do something for myself and leave the family business to its own demise, because when you can't see the day coming, you do get a bit despondent.
So I asked Clive that question from the other side of it, where stepping back, and he said when he answered that question about stepping out and creating the space, he had serious trouble stepping back from something that he'd put 30 years of work into. It was his baby, he'd built it. His biggest problem was trust, and having to place trust in the people to manage the business whilst he still had security on his house with the bank. And if the management stuffed it up, then my wife and I were out on the street. after many sessions with Advisory.Works, helped them to move into a space where he could control it more from a board level, and having a fully structured board process is now so important to him that he's been able to gain that trust in the process. At times, he still grunts to and moans to his wife and said he would do things probably differently. However, he still gets the good outcome, and he recognises that people can do different things to get a similar outcome. And being able to trust that other people's opinions and ways to generate a solution will now be different to his. He still likes to keep in touch with the staff and help motivate, but knows how to sort of keep away and create that space. I've got another question for the panel. Kendall, I'm going to ask this one of you. You're in a different position where you're leading the business and the founder and director is still in the business. What challenges does that bring?
Oh, it brings a huge amount of challenges. I live in the same space as many of the client companies and the CEOs that I work with. The challenges to bring in new thinking and to get the runway to try new things without sort of being pulled back to what happened in the past, because we're an organisation that's been around since '93, and as the founder and majority shareholder, he's working the business for me day to day. So it's challenging. We get around it by having a really good board and independent, and it's just bringing different conversations to the table, and it takes a bit of courage, and it's there's a desire to certainly move forward. So it's disrupting human nature in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Ben and Kate, how have you seen businesses evolve as a result of succession and improve and become better as a result of going through that process? Ben, I'll start with you.
I think Paul's example of old world context, the family's a lifestyle business, perhaps lacked a little bit of discipline and structure, but has been successful despite that. It's probably serviced the needs of the family, and then fresh set of eyes, blank bit of paper. What can we do with this thing? We've got inherent talent, we've got great clients, we've got great pedigree, we've got scale, and suddenly looking at what the opportunities are and how we're going to go and execute. And that's a really live example that we see every day working with our clients. We get fresh sets of eyes, different perspective, fresh energy, and suddenly we've got a different business. So.
Okay, have you seen someone?
I guess picking up on Ben's point, it's that fresh set of eyes and different perspectives. So where we've worked with companies where the owner remains involved but isn't running everything day to day, where that empowerment and that sort of stepping up of the second level of management works, and you say to the owner of the business, well, what would you like to do if you were 20 years younger? What are the three key things that you'd like to see this business achieve? And then go and direct that newly rejuvenated management team to go and execute. And I think that's something that's really gratifying for a lot of business owners, and it's being able to take that step back and put it in perspective and actually see the possibility rather than being trapped in the day-to-day operational challenges of the business. That's really, really pleasing.
Mm. So we've touched on governance and advice. When we think of succession, most of us sort of think about getting some legal advice and some accounting advice. What other sort of key advice would you recommend that people seek as they go on the journey?
I think everybody thinks of legal and accounting advice as the first thing that they need to think about.
So
and obviously, if you want to sell your business, you might want to talk to somebody who can actually execute that sale for you. But again, going back to the very first point that I made, there's a lot of softer things that you need to get your arms around very early on in the process, which is, what do I as a business owner want to achieve out of this? Who do I need to bring on that journey, and do I need some help, like Kendall's situation, with navigating the emotional minefield of dealing with potentially family members or even long-standing work colleagues? Do I need some help in thinking through what is in the world after owning a business for me? So is that wealth management, financial management? Is that coaching in terms of, okay, I'm in my late 50s, there's a wealth of opportunity out there, do I look at governance, what's next? So it's filling in all of the gaps around the sort of the hard structural elements of succession that I think people often overlook, but they're so important to making it work.
Kendall, you probably have another perspective from the behavioural perspective.
I think it picks up on Kate's point there around self-awareness, and there's always a piece around what next, especially as you work with founders to they want to step back but won't, and sometimes it's understanding their strengths and weaknesses and what they want to achieve. So it is a little bit of a coaching or a self-awareness piece. I think it starts there. I certainly believe you need to have a real team of not just advisors, but people who've done it, other CEOs, other founders, networks, as well as good legal and structural accounting advice around it. And it's definitely a soft space. It's the space of a leader. In my view, one of the roles of a leader is to train and groom their successor. And if you don't achieve that, then you've missed a trick. If you walk out the door and the place collapses, you've been the superhero. And I think succession is as much about the professional leaders realm as it is about an owner-founder type approach.
Paul?
I think discussing with or communicating with others that have been on the journey is certainly a good learning, and I guess when you start doing that, talking to other people, it's surprising how the theme is pretty similar to what you're actually going through yourself. I guess families are reasonably complex. I'm sure it's pretty easier to appoint a new CEO than it is to hand it over to the next generation. Family dynamics are all different. We're probably lucky that my brother and my sister wanted to be in the business, so I guess we didn't have that who's in, who's out situation. But it's not easy, I can tell you that.
Ben, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question and then come back to you probably, Paul. What are the differences and the challenges with governance in a family business, do you see?
I can think of two meetings this morning actually, but challenges, I think it's, so in the context of bringing, say, an independent in who sits in the room and helps bring structure to a family business environment, it's actually being sensitive enough to the family dynamic, the fact that blood is thicker or stickier than water, and that these people are, at the end of the day, the family, right? So you sit in the boardroom or you go to work every day and there's a whole lot of stuff that you've got to deal with. But the complexity of family relationships means that, having those really, really hard conversations sometimes gets really, really tough. And so I think the kind of the key challenges is actually around saying the stuff that needs to be said. And I can think of a meeting today, and there was a father and two sons in the room, and no one was saying what needed to be said. And it's on some pretty material stuff around the way that this business is going to be transitioned over the next 6 months. Everyone's agreed it's going to happen. They've broadly agreed the mechanism by which it's going to happen. But there's a whole lot of sort of operational issues, so right down in the trenches, and a whole lot of issues around sort of future strategy where everybody's on a different page. So I think, having someone that can facilitate from a governance perspective, that sort of honesty is really, really important.
How important has it been to get the role clarity between ownership, governance and management?
Well, that's the challenge, especially where you have people wearing all three of those hats. And we have it in our business, and a lot. It's just a reality of New Zealand business. And my experience is the more you can separate those conversations into the correct meeting agenda, and then you can start getting the breakthroughs. And at its worst, you have a founder, shareholder, managing director sitting in there having all three in one sort of meeting, and it's hugely complex. And it's if you can separate them out, in the perfect world you wear different hats. But the way to achieve it is good independent governance and a different framework for that, a shareholder framework so you can discuss shareholder matters, and then your management. If you can separate that, you'll start to get some traction.
When I asked Clive the challenges around governance in a family business, he said, firstly, in a family business, you have to be very, very careful about setting expectations. When bringing the family member into the business, you need to ensure they're coming in for the right reason and they really want to be involved. You need to set down a very clear set of rules right at the start to ensure all parties understand their responsibilities, and it's critical to ensure you have a plan for the company in place and that all parties are clear on that future plan and what they're actually buying into, so that that transition is clear through that process. and then manage that with clear communication of how the plan is to be administered, allow trust to form through the process of developing and executing that. And then he believes that a good plan, a good board and good communication and trust are the key components to ensuring that family business will endure. And we were talking earlier, just off the top of our hand, we knew 5 different family businesses where no one's talking to anyone anymore because it hasn't worked. And so, you know, the difficulties through those processes with family businesses are fraught with different sorts of tensions. And so it's how you navigate that is pretty key. Just moving on to the last section then, some lessons learned. Paul, when you look back on it, what worked really well when you were transitioning the business and what would you do differently?
I guess the day we signed it over was probably the best day. It was a journey, and it took a long time to get to the point where it happened, but probably it happened for a reason, and I think we were pretty well prepared when the day came. We did a lot of work more so with our accountants and lawyers to make sure that it was a fair transition for all parties, and we got the outcome that we wanted. But it's certainly, I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go in behind it, and give yourself some time. But I think we probably didn't. We probably gave ourselves too much time because it was probably a 10-year journey rather than a 2-year journey. But once the wheels are in motion, you're on the ride, and it's good to come out the other side.
So would you have brought that time frame in on reflection?
Oh, I think so, and I guess, as I said earlier on, my parents thought that they were probably going to outlive me and there would be no need to hand it over anyway. So I think you've got to sort of start thinking about it earlier on anyway, even if you don't execute for some time, but at least map it out and show that there is an end date, and it is going to happen. For us, it was pretty blurred and a change from day to day almost. So it's hard for the next generation to really focus on where they're going and what really is going to happen with the business.
When I asked that question of Clive, what he would have done, he said firstly he wouldn't have survived to be able to work through the process if he hadn't had a good mentoring program. It allowed him to have a clear head and to be able to see reason, and to be honest, he was spinning in enough circles as it was without having someone to mentor him. He found that was a godsend, and it allowed him to see what he needed to hear, what he needed to hear, see it for what it really was, and stop making excuses and get held to task. And so that couldn't put things in the too hard bin anymore. Last question for the 3 other panellists. What would be that key piece of advice then you'd give to anyone in the room who's looking at the leadership succession or transition journey?
I guess 3 key things. Don't underestimate how complex it is and how much time it's going to take to get it right. Don't underestimate the people that you have around you and the capability that you may already have within your grasp. And seek outside advice. Make sure you get good people around you from external.
Mine would be start early and do your homework. There's quite a bit it's a big subject, and as Paul said, once you scratch the surface, there are plenty of horror stories out there, but there are also some great stories out there, and if you can network with those that have done it and bank it, if you do invest in good advice, try taking the advice because it often helps. But I also think that one of the softer questions and one of the tougher ones in sort of a coaching space is, what is the legacy that you want to leave? And I think it's a good question to ask a leader at any level. If you're coming into a role short or long term, what's the legacy you will leave? And I talked to someone earlier today, coming out of their business and transitioning, and just proud that it's going to the next generation, and the legacy that you'll leave, could have been sold, etc. So that's a great story. Legacy, it comes back to purpose. So.
Ben?
Look, start early. We've been hammering that point home. There's no doubt about it that where we see a number of issues is when someone turns up and they've had an offer, they haven't been thinking about selling, or for some reason they want to do it tomorrow, to the point in time they don't have it. So, you lose your options. So you need. This is a journey. It's if it goes well, all things being equal, it's a 12-month story, and it's typically longer when you start digging around at the things that need to be done. So time, the independent team, Paul's touched on it, it's not just a pitch for the advisors, but get people, and it's not about the accountant and lawyer specifically, get a team of people that actually understand the journey and listen to the advice, because that's the worst thing. Good advisors, but actually, the engagement isn't there, so you've got to actually take the advice. And, I think thirdly is in taking or in getting external advice, making sure you're really, really clear on what the options are. A lot of people think about, hey, I'm out of the business, I'm going to be giving it to the son, or I'm selling to a trade buyer, but actually, there's a number of nuances across the spectrum of who might actually want your business or who it might be saleable to. And I think getting a really measured, independent lens of what the buyer pool looks like and what the financial realities are for each of those options is really, really important, because they're very, very different. They're different in time, they're different in value, and they're different in terms of things like the lock-in and some of those sort of things. So, really, really good information is important.
Okay, we'll now open the panel to the floor. Who would like to ask a question?
Question for Paul. Have you already started planning your exit?
I'm planning it. I don't want to leave if our generation choose to carry on the business. I don't want to leave them in a position that I was left in. My daughter's the oldest of the 6 children from she'll be the 3rd generation. She's only 20, so but I'm going to be too old, and I don't want to be there when I'm 70 either. So we're thinking about how we're going to manage the business over that period till if or when the next generation want to take over. So it's certainly clear in my mind. I just don't want to put my children through what I've been through.
Thanks, Paul. Anyone else?
This is a question for any of you. Do you think the talent's actually there in the next generation? If you look at, say, accounting firms as an example, they're struggling to find, the successors to come in, sort of in their late 30s, early 40s, to come in and take over the reins. Are you guys seeing that in other industries out there as well?
Which firms are struggling to find successors?
Accounting and legal, from what I've spoken to. So it's just struggling to find the sort of the next generation that, I guess, have the skills, have the hunger to take over a partnership in the next 5 years.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's one we're all grappling with, and if you read social media every day goes past, there's an article about how difficult it is to manage millennials, and they have no responsibility and they don't want to, do we actually know that that's a fact? No. And I think it comes back to one of the topics we spent quite a lot of time on this afternoon, which is leadership and development of leadership. And in some ways, you've got to demonstrate to people what is possible, and believe in them that they can get to where they need to be, and give them the support and the training and the advice and the guidance that they need to get there. As an employer, does that make it any easier to source those people from the market? No, it doesn't. But it makes it all the more important to really hone your ability to recognise talent, use good advice to find those people from wherever they're going to come from. There's innately no fewer talented people in the world. It's just tracking them down. Is my belief.
I think the millennials are actually far more talented. The challenge, in my experience with them, is they really are engaged by a sense of purpose and of people who will invest in and support them. And so I think they're there, but it's a good question. And as you look over the next 10 years, when so many businesses are going to transition, the ones without a good vision and without a really strong culture and a good solid brand are going to struggle to find people to buy them or take over. So it does really come down to this leadership and culture piece, and it's just becoming more and more intentionally discussed now, whereas it was sort of below the line. Yeah, so good question.
Any other questions? Good.
So, Advisory.Works is about strategy as well. So in this process, in your experience with these different successions you're involved in, does the departing leadership set a strategy and hope that the new folks will execute it, or do they step back and let the new team work on the strategy, or is it a bit of a combination of both?
It's a good question. John Spence sent me an article today that CEOs shouldn't be involved in strategy, they should leave it totally to their people. So it was a challenging one. Don't have my opinion on that yet. Strategies, the Horizon 3, the vision is important. It tends to be enduring because it's beyond 10 years and the strategy is quite dynamic. So, I believe that whoever's in the driving seat in the exec team and wider, that's just an evolving, iterating piece of work, and it won't change all the time, but it will change, and it's market related and dynamic. So it needs to continue.
There's certainly an opportune time to review it all, obviously, as part of this whole 12-month, 2-year cycle, I suppose, is that?
I think the other side of that is the relevance of the current strategy. It depends on who's coming in. So if you're talking about succession within the business, and it might be about fresh energy and capitalising on some of those unrealised opportunities, there might be more constant effort around the existing strategy with tweaks. But a trade buyer who's coming in to, buy the client base and do something very different with it clearly has a very different view. So I think that piece around strategy is kind of really relevant to who's actually, who's in that discussion around succession as well.
Any others? I'm sure we'll have the opportunity over some light refreshments to ask some more questions if you don't want to ask them in this forum. And to the panel, the conversation's been insightful and entertaining, and I'm sure that everyone walks away with some greater understanding. And on behalf of those who are here, thanks very much for sharing your knowledge and your experience and your insights. Thank you.